Hello, Escanaba families. This is Dr. Kobe Fletcher, Superintendent of Schools here in Escanaba, again with the final part of the questions that I'll be responding to, and these revolve around health concerns. So, quite a variety of questions, and I'm going to do my best to answer them for you. Just bear in mind that this is the area where we really consult most with the Public Health Department. And we're in weekly communication with them, and things change and evolve with this whole COVID situation. And so I'm going to give you the best, most up to date responses that I can right now. Although I'd ask you to bear in mind that it can and probably will change from time to time, and we'll just have to try to keep you apprised of that as much as possible. Well, let's start out by talking about facial coverings. How did we decide students would have to wear facial coverings? There are a few things that go into a decision like that. One is we received the return to school roadmap from the governor and had to create our plans based on what was included in that document. Being in phase 5, things like masks or facial coverings are strongly recommended. In consultation with the health department, they did make it clear that any child of any age, particularly kids that are older than 5 or 6, should wear masks at all times while they're in school. And we relied heavily on that health department recommendation. It was a strong recommendation. And then, the last thing, and probably the least important consideration here, is that as we talk this over with our legal team, one of the things that came out of that discussion is that schools, if they opt not to implement something that is strongly recommended in the roadmap or that is strongly recommended by the health department, should have a compelling reason that prevents them from implementing the recommendation. And we really have no compelling reason that would prevent us from implementing the wearing of facial coverings. And so we are implementing that. Again, it's a strong recommendation in the roadmap, and it is a very strong recommendation on the part of the health department. Now, what constitutes a facial covering? Does a clear face shield count as a facial covering, and does the facial covering have to cover mouth and nose both? Well, the state hasn't given a very thorough definition on what constitutes a facial covering. So until they do so, we're going to be flexible as we talk about facial coverings. A clear face shield, however, the state and the health department have clarified this, does not count as a facial covering for our purposes. So you would have to wear something beneath a clear face shield in order for it to count as a facial covering. And it would have to be some sort of mask or some sort of neck gaiter, something along those lines. So, for us, what constitutes a facial covering, it would be something like a mask or something like a neck gaiter. Those would be facial coverings. Again, we're being flexible with that definition. It's likely that mosquito netting or something like that would not count. But until that is more clearly defined by the state, we're going to stick with a pretty simple idea of what a facial covering is. Does the facial covering have to cover mouth and nose both? And the answer to that is yes, it does have to cover mouth and nose both. What grades are required to wear facial coverings? Why did you make the change that required facial coverings in grades 1 through 5? So as far as grades that have to wear the facial coverings, those would be students in grades 1 through 12. And why did we make that change? Again, that came about through our consultation with the health department. I think it's fair to say that the health department has been unequivocal and very clear in stating that kids of all ages that can reasonably do it, so that is to say kids of older than 5 or 6 years old, should wear facial coverings at all times while in school. And that does kind of respond to why kindergartners aren't wearing facial coverings. They are a separate campus, and we're able to cohort those students. I'm going to explain that term a little later on. But given that these are 5 or 6 year olds, and we want our staff focused on instruction and not necessarily the facial covering issue, we're opting for different measures for the kindergarten center. I did hear from some parents who felt strongly about kindergartners wearing facial coverings, but ultimately, after looking at the totality of circumstances there, we made the decision that that campus would not wear facial coverings. Now, will students have to wear facial coverings all day? I've used the term all day a couple of times here, and what I want to emphasize to our families is that we are really trying to be reasonable with the idea of facial coverings. We understand that it could potentially be miserable to have to wear that facial covering all day and never be able to take it off. And so we're going to work hard to work regular times into the day during which students can go without the facial coverings and be in a healthy, socially distanced environment. There will be times like recess where students won't be wearing facial coverings, and there will be times such as being in PE where students may not be required to wear facial coverings. And of course, during lunches and breakfasts, students won't be wearing facial coverings. You know, we want to strike a balance here. We want to provide an environment where kids are going to be healthy and safe. We also want to provide an environment where kids will be as at ease as possible. So while we are requiring those facial coverings in grades 1 through 12, I do want to highlight the fact that we're going to work as hard as we can to be as reasonable as we can with this requirement. What about masks in recess, PE, or classes like band? I talked a little bit about that. We're not going to require masks in recess. We will zone kids. I mean, we're going to allow them to play, and they'll be playing on equipment, but we'll be cohorting them. And again, I'll explain that term here in just a sec. PE, where kids are going to be engaged in physical activity that may result in some heavy breathing, we're not going to require the masks. And then classes like band, in a prior recording, when we were talking about band, I mentioned that there are other measures that our teachers in band will explain to the students that we're going to be able to take. But it is hard to play an instrument through a mask, and so there will be some opportunities in classes like that where kids will be doing something other than wearing a mask to participate while being in as healthy and safe an environment as possible. Will facial covering breaks be scheduled? What happens if a child needs a facial covering break and misses instruction? Those breaks will be routine, and so we will be working them into the day. I think, again, to restate what I've said several times, we're going to try to be reasonable and strike a good balance with the facial coverings. If a child needs a break and misses instruction, we'll treat that like we would any time a kid needs a break for a particular reason and misses instruction. We'll allow them to work with the teacher to make up for anything that they did miss. But if a child truly needs a facial covering break, we don't want that child to go without the break. And so we'll work opportunities for that in as well. Why doesn't the school let parents decide whether or not to send their children to school with facial coverings? And again, it goes back to our study of the roadmap, our consultation with the public health department, and then also our consultation with our legal team. Through that, the decision was reached to require facial coverings for students in grades 1 through 5. What if my child has asthma or a medical condition? And I'll lump that in with the next question. What do you mean when you say we need a note from a medical professional for students who are medically unable to tolerate wearing facial coverings? Those two go together because in each circumstance, I think we would have parents who feel that for a medical reason, their child should be exempted from wearing a mask. And the terminology we've used is that we need a statement that says students are medically unable to tolerate wearing facial coverings. As I have spoken with multiple parents over the course of the last week and a half, one of the things that they say to me regularly is my doctor doesn't really want to use the term medically unable to tolerate wearing facial coverings. Some people have told me that they're just uneasy with it. Some people have told me that they're worried about liability. Uh, here's where we land with that most of the time. Um, we avoid telling parents and doctors that we need to have detailed information on the medical conditions that their children have, unless parents and doctors feel like that's important information to share with school. We understand HIPAA protections, and we wouldn't force a parent or a doctor to disclose if they were not at ease disclosing that. But what I've found that some of our medical professionals are comfortable saying is, the parent has authorized me to tell you a little bit about this condition, and these are the reasons why it would not be advisable for a student to wear a mask or to wear a mask all day. And for us, that documentation would be sufficient. We won't have just a simple parent opt-out, but if the doctor explains to us, what the condition is and why wearing a mask might not be good for a child with that condition, and the parent comes to us and says, really here are the valid medical reasons that my doctor states that lead me to request a mask exemption for my child, we as schools will work with that. And really that's the goal here, is to work with parents who may have these concerns, to work with the medical professionals who may have concerns about how they express this. Again, we want to draw a clear line, but we also want to be reasonable. So if you are struggling with this, communicate with your medical professional, communicate with the school, and if need be, we are happy to communicate between us and the medical professional as well. And hopefully through that process, for children who do have medical conditions and for parents who do have genuine worries about the medical conditions that their children have and how that may interact with wearing a face covering, I have a feeling that we can probably come to some consensus that will work for everybody. Can you tell us if our child is in a class with a student who is not wearing a facial covering due to a medical exemption? Unfortunately, we cannot. We couldn't disclose that information about your child to somebody else, and we can't disclose information about other children to you. And so we have to respect the privacy of those children and their families who may have a medical exemption and are not wearing a mask. I got a suggestion that maybe they could be all placed into the same classroom. Unfortunately, we're not going to have the right number of medical exempted children to place them in a single classroom. It's just not going to be enough. But this is one of those things where we simply as a school just cannot disclose that. What if students are non-compliant with facial coverings? We don't want to turn this into a situation where kids are getting in trouble. And we're not looking to get kids in trouble when it comes to facial coverings. If students are non-compliant, we're going to try to work with them. And hopefully through working with them, talking about things like mask breaks, providing opportunities throughout the day for kids to be able to take those masks off, we'll be able to address issues of non-compliancy. Will the school have extra masks on hand? Yes, we do know that we're going to have extra masks on hand. We'll have quite a few of them actually. We are asking parents to provide masks for their children. One of the reasons for that is because we're flexible with what we consider to be a facial covering or a mask. Parents and their children can try different things out and find what works for them and use that as opposed to just the singular type of mask that we may have on hand as a school district. But if there's a need, we will have the masks. Do staff have to wear masks? And yes, staff do have to wear masks. So we will all be walking around the building when the school year starts with masks on. Will students have to wear gloves? No, students will not have to wear gloves. There's no requirement to do that. I am not a medical professional, so I don't want to speculate too much, but what I have heard through our discussions is that when students wear gloves, they touch things and then they touch other things, and wearing the glove doesn't really prevent the spread of germs or other things from one surface to another. Are we social distancing students? We will to the extent that we can. Our schools, unfortunately, and most schools in the nation aren't large enough to have all of our kids in at once and have them be socially distant. We may be able to provide some individual settings in which kids are socially distant. So, for example, lunches and in cafeterias, if kids are in gyms or large areas like that, or if kids are outside for mask breaks or are kind of spread out in one of those spots for a mask break, we'll be socially distancing students. But as a routine measure in our classrooms, it's not going to be possible to socially distance students. Do kids in the same household have to social distance? Well, this is an interesting question because you don't actually have to be socially distant if you're from the same household and let's just say you're outside or you're attending an event. Um, I can see maybe a question about this occurring at lunches. If you had children who were in the same household who wanted to eat lunch together, would they have to be socially distant? That's a situation where I think you would want to work with your child's principal to determine when and where kids from the same household would or wouldn't have to be socially distant from each other. And what do we mean by a socially distanced lunch? Well, that means that in lines and at tables, we're going to have kids about 6 feet away from each other. I talked about lunches in the part 1 video. There are times kids are going to be in classrooms together not wearing masks eating lunch, and it's likely we won't be able to socially distance there. We'll be in more of a cohorted model. But socially distance means about 6 feet away from each other, and that's what we're aiming for with lunches. What will hallways look like in schools? Will they be crowded or will you stagger classes? That will be different by campus. It is much easier to keep hallways uncrowded and to stagger student times in hallways when you are in elementary schools. When you get to secondary schools, it becomes a little bit more difficult. We will be able to do some staggering and we'll be able to, in some ways, minimize the number of students that are in the hallway. But realistically, at the secondary level, we will be relying more on things like mask wearing in the hallways than we will social distancing or staggering student time in hallways. Will there be limits on things like the number of kids in bathrooms? Yeah, we'll be restricting the number of students in bathrooms to the number of stalls that are available, so we won't be allowing crowded bathrooms. And I'll be talking a little bit more on how we're going to be keeping areas like bathrooms clean here shortly. Will kids be able to play on recess equipment? Yes, we want kids being kids, and in the roadmap and from the health department, really the only guidance is that recess equipment has to continue to be maintained as it has been in the past. So we will not be preventing kids from playing on recess equipment. Now we get to that other fancy term I have been using. What is a cohorted room? Really what cohorting means is that you are keeping kids within a particular classroom as together as you possibly can and preventing as much as possible interaction between different classrooms at the same time. That's cohorting. And that's something that we will primarily be implementing at the kindergarten level. So that's a brief description of what a cohorted room is. How will we be cleaning classrooms and surfaces? And then I'll bring in the next question as well. How often will classrooms and other areas of the school be cleaned? So in phase 5, we do need to regularly clean surfaces that are commonly touched. And so for kids, that would be things like desks and chairs. In classrooms, it would be things like light switches or door handles. Those will be cleaned on a very regular basis. So if classrooms are going to switch, for example, we would be cleaning those before the classrooms switch. As a district, we have ordered a bunch of cleaning materials and personal protective equipment. That includes wipes, it includes sprays, it includes hand sanitizer. Sometimes teachers will be working with the cleaning. There will be sometimes students will be helping out. I do want to be clear that at no time would we ever expect students to be cleaning or wiping off a desktop with anything other than something that can be used for that purpose and doesn't require things like gloves or goggles, that kind of thing. That would be routine cleaning, and we'll be doing a lot of that. After a student touches a toy, that toy will need to be wiped down. After students touch art supplies, for example, those art supplies are going to need to be wiped down. When students in a 7th grade ELA classroom leave to go to their math classroom, those desktops and chairs need to be wiped down along with door handles and light switches. So classrooms are one thing. Then we also have frequently used common areas in the buildings. I guess I should go back to that and say that we'll also be deep cleaning classrooms at the end of the day, every day. We're going to be increasing our custodial capacity in order to get that done. But in addition to kind of the routine cleaning that will happen on a regular basis during the day in classrooms, we're going to be deep cleaning at the end of the day, every day. We have other areas of the school that are used with great frequency. Restrooms are a great example of this, and we're working with our custodial provider to staff our schools so that we can clean restrooms, thoroughly clean and disinfect restrooms on an hourly basis. That's a little more frequent than many of our custodial providers' other clients are having them clean. But we feel like it's really important that restrooms be cleaned on a very, very frequent basis. There are other things that need to be cleaned on about an hourly basis as well. So that would be door handles, push bars, and things like that at entryways and exits to the building. Door handles and things like offices. Water fountains are a big one. Actually, we will be shutting down the bubblers on water fountains. That sometimes elicits a chuckle when I use that term, but it's the thing you drink out of. And we'll be replacing those with bottle refillers. And so you'll see that transition being made with water fountains in the district, but we'll still have to clean them on a very regular basis. Lunchrooms, where we are staggering lunches or where we have lunches in shifts, those tables are going to have to be thoroughly cleaned between lunches. Buses are another example of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about busing later. But there's a lot of very, very frequent disinfection that's going to have to take place. This is all mentioned in our Return to Learn plan, and that is available on our website under our COVID resources page. And so if you actually want to see what the plan says in detail, you can go there and pull it up and check it out. There are quite a few other COVID-related resources that respond to a lot of the questions we have in here in more detail than I'm providing right now. So that spot is a good spot for you to check out if you want to learn a lot more about it. Will we be checking students' temperatures? So laws are a funny thing. Sometimes things make their way into law and you kind of scratch your head about how it is that they got there. Believe it or not, the law prevents us from checking students' temperatures. I know it's common procedure oftentimes in schools throughout the nation. When a kid comes into the nurse's office, they may take their temperature to see if they really have a fever. But the law prevents us from doing things like checking the temperature of every student or staff member as they walk into the school building. Now, how on earth that made it into law, your guess is as good as mine. But what often happens is something happened somewhere and somebody contacted a legislator and that got tacked into a bill. But we are actually legally prevented from routinely checking every student's temperature as they come into buildings. So what we're going to be relying on, and this too is in our COVID resources page, are pre-screenings or self-screenings. So things that, a checklist, for example, that families or staff members can go through before they send children into schools, and that will give you, some idea of whether or not given symptoms that your child may have, you can go ahead and send them to school, or you should just keep them home until the symptoms go away. Now we get into the really tough questions, and these are determinations about when kids should be sent to what we're going to be calling the quarantine room, or when they should be sent home, when they should be sent home in quarantine, when they should be sent home and asked to get a test. Not easy questions to answer, and the reason for that is that as the health department tracks COVID cases, one of the things they track are the symptoms that the people who test positive are preventing. And believe it or not, those symptoms and the combination of symptoms evolve. And so they may change from week to week. And so what I tell you now may be a little bit different next week. That's one of the things that we deal with this. But we have some resources on our COVID page and some flow charts and some other types of diagrams that respond to these questions in much more detail, but I'm going to try to go through and give you really a broad brush response. So how will we determine when a student needs to leave the classroom because they're sick? We'll pay attention to kids being sick really in the same way that we have in the past. Will we likely be more attuned to things like a cough or a fever or a headache? Yes. But we'll be using that information that we get from the health department to determine whether or not a kid needs to leave the classroom and be sent to the quarantine room. The quarantine room is the place that we need to have on campus to hold kids who are feeling sick while we're waiting for parents to come pick them up. So if a student in class becomes sick and they're showing symptoms to a certain extent, or a combination of symptoms that lead us to believe that this child does need to leave the classroom, we'll send them down to the quarantine room where they'll be able to get a little more individual attention. We can contact parents and have parents come pick those children up. Now, how will we determine when a student will have to quarantine? Again, typically that is a function of the symptoms that a student is displaying. And so if there's a combination of things like a cough, shortness of breath, a headache, and a fever, those, at least for the time being, are pretty classical symptoms of COVID. It's likely that a student who has or is displaying those symptoms to a significant degree will be told that they need to quarantine or to go get a test to determine whether or not they're COVID positive. A lot of those are judgment calls that we have to make, and we make them in based on the information that we get from the health department. Now, what about students with allergies or coughs that may be due to a dry throat? Where parents are aware of that, we just ask you to keep us informed. If your kid has allergies and it's going to lead to, a cough or a stuffy nose, or even sometimes, you have asthma that is brought on by allergies, and there might be some shortness of breath. If you let us know, those are things that we're more than happy to work with. Coughs due to a dry throat, that's the same thing. We don't want to send kids home and tell them they have to quarantine just because they have the sniffles. That is definitely not the goal here. I should also talk a little bit about what quarantining entails. When we're talking about quarantining, typically kids need to spend a minimum, kids and adults really, a minimum of 10 days in quarantine. You want to see 3 days of decreasing symptoms, and then essentially a day symptom-free without any medication. So really roughly 2 weeks is what's entailed in a quarantine. Of course, the best way to shorten a quarantine when a kid does have serious symptoms is to have a negative test for COVID. But those are things that we're going to have to work with on an individual case-by-case basis. And what I can say right now is we're just going to do our best with the information that we have. And if you want to have some idea of what we're working off of, check out our COVID resources page, and that information will be there. If somebody has flu or strep throat, in particular, if they have flu or strep throat that's serious enough to go to the doctor for, and strep throat is pretty much always serious enough to go to the doctor for, I believe your medical provider is going to be encouraging that testing take place. Testing for strep throat, testing for flu, testing for COVID. So it's likely that would happen automatically. But if we have some kind of doctor's note that says, hey, this is flu, strep throat, not COVID, then those kids could come back like they normally would after they've gotten over the flu or the strep throat. Oh, if a student has to quarantine due to symptoms, when are they allowed back? I explained that in the last slide. I mean, it really is about a 14-day process if you're looking at quarantining due to symptoms and you're not going to get a COVID test. Will we make allowances for kids who miss a lot of school because they have to quarantine? Yes, we will, and we would work with that just like we work with any extended absence. And we have multiple options there. There are online options. I talked about that in the last presentation. We have a few Mobots running around. I talked about that as well. Those are the little robots that a kid with a Chromebook can steer around from class to class and listen in and be present and ask questions, that kind of thing. Or it could be something as simple as sending packets of work home. This might also be a function of how sick a child is as well. If the child is too ill to do any work, we're going to be understanding of that also. So how will a student being sent home for quarantine impact other students in the classroom? And at what point will other students be quarantined? This is a good question. The health department does not want schools saying who needs to be quarantined when there's a positive case of COVID. So what will happen is if we have a student or an adult in the school that tests positive, we have a confirmed positive for COVID-19, then the health department will be contacting us as part of the contact tracing procedure, and they will be telling us based on the information we give them who needs to quarantine. Now you could be finding out whether or not you need to quarantine from the school or from the health department depending on who takes on what duties, but the school will not arbitrarily be deciding who quarantines when a child or an adult in a particular classroom or school has a confirmed positive test for COVID-19. So what's the protocol when a student tests positive for COVID? Is it different depending on grade level? In general, there aren't any differences in protocol when a student tests positive or when a staff member or other adult in the building tests positive. The health department initiates the contact tracing, and from there, students that the health department or other adults that the health department decides should quarantine will be told to quarantine. So the next question, what's the protocol when a teacher, bus driver, or other staff member tests positive for COVID? Really basically the same as when a student tests positive for COVID. The health department kind of takes over at that point. We work with them on contact tracing and they tell us who needs to quarantine, and then those people will be contacted and told to quarantine. If a teacher tests positive for COVID, will students in the class have to quarantine? The magic numbers here, well, let me back up a little bit. The term that you'll often hear used when we talk about quarantine is close contact. So a medical provider, for example, will say that anybody who has been in close contact with somebody who tests positive for COVID-19 will need to quarantine. The definition of close contact, at least the one that we have right now, this is another one of those things that could always change, is being within 6 feet of somebody for more than 15 minutes. And so as the health department does its contact tracing, what they'll be trying to find out is who was within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes of somebody who tested positive for COVID. Does that mean a whole class will necessarily have to quarantine if a teacher tests positive for COVID? It's going to be dependent on what the health department decides based on the information that they get. And then will the school have to close if someone gets COVID? If we have isolated COVID cases, it's not likely that schools will have to close. But again, that is a determination that is made really in collaboration between the school and the public health department. So school closures, they do generally work that way. There are times of the year, for example, when flu is going around, where we're reporting our flu rates to the health department. And if it gets above a certain percentage, they may recommend that we close that campus for a day, maybe on a Friday, to give a Friday and a weekend for the flu to kind of work its way out of the population. I anticipate that it would be somewhat similar here. Now it's also possible that if COVID is really starting to fly in a particular region, the governor or the folks that she works with at the state level might decide that a region needs to shift back into a phase 4 or a phase 1, 2, or 3. And in that case, of course, then the decision is just simply made for us. And then are the procedures the same at the Escanaba Student Success Center? The Success Center is located on the ISD campus, and so we will be adapting to the requirements of the ISD there. If Success Center students come over to the high school business, either to the high school to take care of business related to a class they're taking, or somebody needs to come over and pick up some food, at that point we'll expect them to follow our procedures. But as far as I know, I think the procedures between the Escanaba Area Public Schools and the ISD are very similar. So it's likely that a kid that is meeting or following the procedures of one will also be following the procedures of another. And that is about it for this slide, and we are pretty much to the end of the questions that people asked. Again, I guess I want to emphasize that we are trying to take a reasonable approach that is going to keep kids safe, healthy, and keep our buildings clean. But we're also going to be evaluating our approach on a regular basis. So there might be times that we discover things that we need to tighten up on. There may be times that we discover things that we're going to be able to loosen up on a little bit. We're open to the potential for change here, and I think it's important to let our community know that. The environment in which kids get their education is important. We do not want to go so strict on things that it becomes unreasonable. But at the same time, we don't want to be too laid back about things because we don't want schools to end up having to close, and we don't want massive number of kids to end up having to quarantine. So for us, it really is about striking a balance. And I just want you to know that while not everybody may be happy about everything that is included in our planning, we really are trying to be reasonable as we go through this. If you do have questions about things, here our website is pretty useful. We have good resources related to COVID. They explain, as I've said several times, in much more detail things that I've explained briefly in this video. And then campus-specific questions should always be addressed to the campus. We're looking forward to the school year. I know everybody is very curious and anxious about what it's going to look like as we get started. We have good people working in our schools. We have good students. We have supportive families. And as we work together, I am confident that this is going to be a good school year. I just look forward to getting started. Thank you very much.